Exactly. 3 weeks before my only daughter's wedding, I received a text message so incredibly cold, so aggressively detached, that I honestly thought it had been sent to the wrong person. I was standing in my kitchen when my smartphone buzzed against the granite countertop. There was nothing inherently unusual about that. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in early May, the kind of crisp, brilliant Ohio spring day where the sun finally starts winning its long, bitter fight with winter. I had spent the entire morning doing manual labor mowing the thick lawn, pulling weeds, and aggressively trimming the heavy oak hedges that lined my long driveway. My shoulders ached, and my knees definitely weren't what they used to be back in my active duty days, so I was taking a hard-earned break with a steaming cup of black coffee. The phone vibrated again, vibrating across the counter. The screen lit up. Ashley. I smiled warmly. When I saw my daughter's name, she had been so incredibly busy with wedding preparations over the last few months that our usual conversations had dwindled to quick, hurried updates. I assumed she was texting me to ask about the rehearsal dinner schedule, or perhaps to double-check my suit measurements. I wiped the dirt from my hands, unlocked the screen, and opened the message. My smile instantly vanished. The message read, "Dad, you can come to the wedding if you sign the house over to me by Friday. But if you don't expect a seat up front or an invitation at all." I read the words once, then I read them twice, then a third time, scanning every single syllable, desperately trying to find the punchline. I wish I could tell you that my military instincts flared up immediately, and I got fiercely angry right away. I didn't at first. I was just profoundly, deeply confused. I checked the sender ID again. It was definitely Ashley. I looked around the empty kitchen, almost expecting someone to jump out from behind the refrigerator and explain what the hell I was reading. The refrigerator simply hummed its low, steady, mechanical tune. The coffee maker clicked quietly as it cooled down. Outside the large window, a robin hopped innocently across the freshly cut grass of the backyard. Everything in the world looked perfectly normal. Absolutely nothing felt normal. I lowered my aching body into a wooden dining chair and stared at the glowing screen. Ashley was 31 years old. She was my only child, the little girl who used to run full speed into my arms when I came home from long deployments. The little girl whose height was still meticulously marked. On the wooden doorframe leading to the hallway, barely 10 feet away from where I was sitting, I looked at those faded pencil marks automatically. Age 6, age 9, age 12. The highest final mark was from her senior year of high school. My late wife, Linda, had vehemently insisted we never, ever paint over them, even when we remodeled the hallway. "Those stay forever, Robert," she had always said, her voice brooking no argument. Linda had been gone for 8 years now, cancer. It was a vicious, rapid illness that had stripped away the most vibrant woman I had ever known. Some days, her absence felt like it had just happened yesterday. Other days, it felt like I had lived an entire lifetime without her. I looked down and read the text message again. The cruel words didn't magically change. A few agonizing seconds later, the 3 gray typing dots appeared on the screen, and another message arrived. "Dad, Trevor and I think this is the smartest and most logical way to secure our financial future. We need leverage for our new portfolio." Then another message followed immediately, delivering a blow that nearly knocked the wind out of me. Mom would have wanted us to have financial stability. She would agree with Trevor. That one hit me infinitely harder than the first message. My hands, the same hands that had disassembled sniper rifles in pitch-black conditions, began to shake. I put the phone face down on the wooden table. For a long, suffocating minute, I couldn't even bear to look at the dark casing. Nobody on this earth gets to tell me what Linda would have wanted. Especially not via a cowardly text message, and especially not after using her sacred memory as a cheap bargaining chip in a real estate negotiation. I stood up, pushing the chair back so hard the legs scraped violently against the floor, walked outside, and stood on the back deck. The massive maple tree near the perimeter fence was taller than the roof of the house now. Ashley and I had planted that tree together when she was just 7 years old, her tiny hands covered in mud, laughing as she patted the soil. The tree looked healthy, strong, deeply rooted. It's funny how children can grow in directions you completely fail to anticipate. My name is Robert Vance. To my neighbors, my daughter, and her arrogant fiancé, I am a quiet, blue-collar retiree who spent 30 years working a mundane management job for the regional utility company. They see a man who drives an older truck, wears worn-out flannel shirts, and spends his weekends fixing leaky faucets and gardening. What they don't know, what I spent my entire adult life carefully concealing to protect my family, is that the utility company job was a deeply embedded cover. I am a retired intelligence contractor and a former special forces operator. For decades, I analyzed threat patterns, dismantled hostile financial networks, and conducted operations that officially never happened. I spent my life reading people, dissecting their motives, and anticipating their betrayals. I went quiet when Linda got sick, fading entirely into my civilian cover, fully burying the lethal, analytical side of my past to be a simple father. Looking back with the cold, hard logic of my former profession, Ashley's text message didn't actually come out of nowhere. I had just desperately didn't want to see what was happening right in front of me. A lot of parents don't. We explain things away. We make excuses. Because blinding ourselves to the truth is infinitely easier than facing the agonizing reality of who our children are becoming. Trevor had been around for almost 3 years. At first, I genuinely liked the guy. He was clean-cut, impeccably well-spoken, worked in high-end financial consulting, always exceedingly polite, and always flashing a brilliant, white smile. But then, the subtle, insidious little things started bothering my instincts. Trevor talked about money constantly. Not because he needed it, but because he seemed utterly, sociopathically fascinated by it. Every single conversation somehow magically drifted back to aggressive investments, liquid assets, property leverage, or aggressive wealth building. He didn't see people. He saw portfolios. I remember one specific Thanksgiving dinner. Trevor had leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of expensive wine he had insisted on bringing, looked around my beautifully maintained dining room, and casually remarked, "You know, Robert, you've got a massive amount of untapped equity just sitting dead in these walls. It's wildly inefficient." I had laughed it off, assuming it was just a terrible attempt at professional humor. He wasn't joking. His eyes had been scanning my home the way a vulture scans a dying animal. Another time, while we were watching a football game, he asked what my retirement accounts and pension structures looked like. He didn't ask directly, he asked casually, skillfully weaving the interrogation into normal conversation. I recognized the tactic instantly. It was a standard intelligence gathering technique. I firmly changed the subject. Ashley hadn't noticed, or maybe she simply hadn't wanted to. Then, chillingly, Ashley's language started changing, too. Little things, small enough to ignore if you weren't trained to look for behavioral shifts. She stopped calling me Daddy. Then she stopped calling every Sunday afternoon. Instead of asking how my health was, she started asking whether I had seriously thought about downsizing, whether an old widower really needed a sprawling 3-bedroom house on a large plot of land. She asked whether maintaining the property was becoming too difficult for me. It was always framed as deep, loving concern. It always sounded perfectly reasonable. That's exactly what made the manipulation so hard to definitively recognize. Trevor wasn't just dating my daughter. He was actively running a psychological operation on her, slowly isolating her loyalties and reprogramming her to view me not as a father, but as a stubborn obstacle standing between them and a major financial asset. Nothing happened all at once. It happened one carefully calculated inch at a time. My phone rang, shattering the quiet of the backyard. It was Ashley. I didn't answer. I let it go straight to voicemail, then it rang again. Then again. By the 5th consecutive call, I turned the volume completely off. I wasn't ready to speak. If I spoke to her now, the soldier would answer, not the father. And the soldier was currently calculating exactly how to utterly dismantle Trevor's life. That evening, I heated up some leftover chili and sat in my worn recliner. The television was on, displaying some meaningless sports broadcast. I couldn't tell you what was happening on the screen. My mind was operating at 1,000 miles an hour, analyzing the battlefield. Around 9 o'clock, another text message arrived. This one was a massive block of text. Ashley explained, using Trevor's sterile corporate vocabulary, that transferring the house deed to them before the wedding would definitively demonstrate my commitment to supporting their future enterprise. She wrote 3 massive paragraphs about tax burdens and leveraging capital. The more she explained, the worse and more manipulative it sounded. Not once in those 3 paragraphs did she ask how I felt. Not once did she acknowledge the sheer cruelty of what she was demanding. This house wasn't some random, emotionless investment property. It was my home. The home her mother and I had spent 32 years working double shifts to pay off. The home where we celebrated every birthday, every Christmas morning, every graduation, and every anniversary. I stared at the blinking cursor on my phone screen for nearly 20 minutes. I typed and deleted 3 different emotional responses. Finally, my training took over. Emotion is a vulnerability. Cold, hard finality is a weapon. I typed one single, simple sentence. Then I'll keep the deed, and you can keep the seat. I hit send. Almost immediately, my phone started ringing frantically. Ashley. Then again and again, 12 calls before midnight. I answered absolutely none of them. I simply locked the doors, turned off the lights, and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up exactly at 0600. I made my coffee, stepped out onto the porch, fed the local birds, and carefully watered the vibrant flower beds that Linda used to love so much. Then I walked back inside and picked up the phone. I didn't call Ashley. I called someone else, a man named Frank Delaney. Frank was my private attorney, and he was one of the very few people left on this earth who knew my entire operational history and exactly what I was capable of. Because there was something very specific about this house that Ashley didn't know. Something I had never told her. Because she had never needed to know. And before this wedding occurred, that heavily guarded secret was going to detonate Trevor's carefully constructed world and change absolutely everything. I met Frank Delaney, my attorney, and one of the few who knew my Black Ops past. Frank looked up from his messy desk the second I walked in. One look at the set of my jaw, and he knew instantly that the quiet, retired father had vanished, and the operator had returned. "What's happened, Robert?" he asked, sitting up straight. I didn't say a word. I just walked over and handed him my phone, the screen open to Ashley's text messages. Frank read the messages silently. His eyes narrowed. He read them a second time, then leaned back heavily in his leather chair. For several long seconds, the only sound in the office was the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, he exhaled a long, slow breath. "Well," Frank said grimly, "that is one hell of a wedding invitation." I let out a harsh, dry laugh, not because it was funny, but because sometimes a bitter laugh is the only alternative to tearing the room apart. Frank slid the phone back across the desk. "How long has this particular operation been building?" The phrasing caught me off guard. Operation, but Frank was right. This wasn't a sudden emotional outburst from a stressed bride. This was a calculated strike. Longer than I wanted to admit, Frank. He's been isolating her, changing her vocabulary, reprogramming her to view my assets as their rightful leverage. Frank nodded slowly. "Tell me everything." I briefed him on Trevor's manipulation. When I finished my sit-rep, Frank folded his hands together on the desk. "You know why he's pushing for the deed transfer now, right before the wedding?" "Because once they are married, I have less leverage," I replied. "But there's more to it. Trevor is desperate. You don't make a hostile demand like this unless you are operating against a ticking clock. I need you to run a deep dive financial background check on him. Not the public credit reports. I want the ghost accounts, the shell companies, everything." Frank offered a sharp predator's smile. "I already started pulling his files the moment you called this morning. But Robert, we need to discuss the primary asset, the house." I nodded. The house, the absolute centerpiece of Trevor's arrogant strategy. Years earlier, I had made a massive legal decision to honor Linda. Working quietly with Frank, I had created an irrevocable charitable housing trust. The legal structure was bulletproof and permanent. Upon my eventual death, the house would not be sold for profit or fought over in probate court. It would be immediately transferred to a verified organization that provided emergency housing programs for disabled veterans and widows. The house was perfectly legally protected. "The trust is locked down, Robert," Frank said, tapping a thick manila folder on his desk. "It is completely impenetrable. Trevor could hire the best corporate lawyers in New York, and they couldn't crack this trust. The house is entirely secure." "I know," I said quietly. "Then why do you look like you're preparing to go to war?" "Because the security of the house isn't what's bothering me, Frank," I replied, my voice hardening. "It's the fact that my daughter made the demand at all. It's the fact that Trevor has manipulated her into believing that threatening to banish me from her wedding is a perfectly reasonable negotiation tactic. That is what I'm going to destroy." I left Frank's office around noon, my mind shifting seamlessly back into operational mode. I had an old cyber warfare contact named Elias dig into Trevor. "Dig everything up," I typed. "I want his digital soul." Less than 3 hours later, while I was sitting in my living room, a massive encrypted file dropped into my inbox. Elias was incredibly fast, and what he found was absolutely horrifying. Trevor wasn't a successful financial consultant. He was a spectacular, catastrophic fraud. Trevor was drowning in debt from failed offshore schemes. But the most sickening part of the file was a master spreadsheet Elias had extracted directly from Trevor's private cloud drive. It was brutally labeled Asset Acquisition and Recovery Strategy. I opened it. The spreadsheet detailed Trevor's meticulous, step-by-step plan to save himself from total financial ruin. And right there, sitting at the very top of his recovery strategy, was my address. My home. Trevor's plan was shockingly simple and utterly ruthless. He intended to force me to sign the house over to Ashley before the wedding. Once the deed was in her name, because they would be legally married, it would become a marital asset. Trevor planned to immediately use the completely paid-off house as collateral to secure a massive, high-interest commercial loan to pay off his aggressive creditors. And according to his own projected numbers on the spreadsheet, Trevor fully mathematically expected to default on that commercial loan within 18 months. Trevor fully expected to default on the loan, leaving Ashley homeless. I didn't feel sick anymore. I felt a cold, hyper-focused fury settle into my bones. The kind of fury that wins wars. Trevor had targeted the wrong family. He thought he was playing a gullible old utility worker. He didn't realize he had just declared war on a man who specialized in dismantling hostile threats. The week leading up to the wedding was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The phone calls from relatives started pouring in almost immediately. Ashley had clearly been deploying her narrative. My younger sister, Nancy, called me, her voice dripping with judgment. "Robert, what on earth are you doing?" she demanded. "What do you mean, Nancy?" I asked calmly. "You know exactly what I mean. Ashley is in tears. Don't let your stubborn pride ruin the most important day of her life." "It's just a house, Robert. Compromise." A few days later, late in the afternoon, Ashley's car suddenly pulled into my driveway. She was alone, no Trevor, no audience, just my daughter. I wiped my hands on a shop towel and walked out to meet her. She climbed out of the car, looking completely exhausted. Her eyes were red and swollen, like she had been crying for days. "Dad," she whispered. Just hearing her voice, seeing her look so broken, softened the hardened soldier inside me for a dangerous, fleeting moment. We walked into the kitchen. The exact same kitchen where Linda used to make pancakes every single Sunday morning. Ashley sat at the table, staring down at her trembling hands. I poured her a cup of coffee. Eventually, she looked up, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "I'm so sorry things got so incredibly ugly, Dad," she sobbed. I nodded slowly, taking a seat across from her. "Me too, Ashley." For a brief, painful moment, I genuinely thought she had come to apologize. I thought my daughter had finally broken through Trevor's brainwashing. She cried. She talked about the crushing stress of the wedding, about the massive expenses, about how absolutely terrified she was of the future. And honestly, her fear was very real. I found myself remembering the little girl who used to sneak downstairs on Christmas morning. I started to believe we were going to find our way back to each other. Then, she took a deep, shuddering breath, looked me right in the eyes, and delivered the killing blow. "Just sign the house over, Dad," she pleaded, her voice thick with tears. "Trevor says if you just sign the papers, all of this pressure goes away. Everything can just go back to normal. We can be a family again." The kitchen went dead silent. She wasn't apologizing. She was executing Trevor's final desperate play, using her tears to manipulate my love. Trevor says, I stared at her, really stared at her, trying to find the daughter I had raised. "You want me to surrender my home, the home your mother and I built, just to appease your fiancé?" She reached across the table, her face hardening. "Dad, you don't understand leverage," Trevor says. "No," I interrupted, my voice dropping to a flat, commanding tone that instantly silenced her. "I am absolutely not discussing what Trevor says." Ashley looked genuinely offended. She truly believed she was the victim here. The conversation unraveled completely after that. By the time she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, neither of us had changed our position. But something inside me had finally, irrevocably snapped shut. The hope I had been desperately clinging to was gone. Trevor had completely compromised her. The only way to save her now was to utterly destroy him. 2 days later was the rehearsal dinner. I almost didn't go. Frank had advised against it. But I needed to gather final intel. I needed to look the enemy in the eye. At the rehearsal dinner, I sat quietly and observed. I spent the entire evening sitting quietly in the back observing, watching Trevor operate. Near the end of the night, I stepped outside into the cool evening air to clear my head. The parking lot was dimly lit. That was when I heard Trevor's arrogant voice echoing from the smoking section near the corner of the building. He was standing with 2 of his groomsmen, unaware that I was standing in the shadows just 20 feet away. "Is the old man still holding out?" one of the groomsmen asked. Trevor laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Yeah, he's being a stubborn boomer, but don't worry, he'll fold. They always fold when the daughter turns on the waterworks. By tomorrow afternoon, I'll have the deed in hand, and if he doesn't?" the other friend asked. Trevor took a drag of his cigar, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke. "It doesn't matter. The house is a massive asset. Once we're married, I'll leverage Ashley to force him into a reverse mortgage if I have to. He's just a pathetic retired utility worker. He's got nowhere else to go. I own this situation." The casual, sociopathic arrogance of his words didn't make me angry. It made me absolutely certain of what I had to do. There was no hesitation left. There was no anger, no hostility, just cold, calculated tactical execution. I quietly turned around, walked back to my truck, and climbed behind the steering wheel. I stared out, through the windshield at the glowing lights of the restaurant. Inside that building, Trevor was celebrating his impending victory, fully believing he had successfully cornered a weak old man. He had made a fatal mistake. Tomorrow was the wedding day, and tomorrow I was going to unleash hell. The morning of the wedding began exactly like any other operation. Quietly, too quietly, at exactly 8 o'clock, Frank Delaney called. "You good, Robert?" he asked, his voice rough with morning sleep. "As good as I'm going to be, Frank. You still planning to go through with this?" I looked across the peaceful backyard. "Affirmative, you don't have to," Frank offered gently. "You can just walk away. Let the lawyers handle Trevor after the wedding." "No," I replied firmly. "This is my daughter. I handle my own." After a brief pause, Frank delivered a piece of advice that stayed with me for the rest of the day. "Whatever happens today, Robert, don't lose your dignity trying to save somebody else's." It was simple advice, and it was perfect. I hung up the phone and spent the next few hours methodically getting ready. I put on a sharp, tailored navy suit, one of the few expensive things I owned, bought specifically for occasions where I needed to project authority. I buttoned a crisp white shirt, tied a conservative silk tie, and finally strapped on the heavy silver watch Linda had given me for our 25th anniversary. By noon, I was on the highway, driving towards Cincinnati. The upscale venue was packed with guests. The ceremony was scheduled to begin sharply at 2 o'clock. I arrived at 1:30. I was intentionally late, but not dramatically late. Just late enough to completely avoid standing around, making meaningless small talk with relatives who had spent the last week judging me. As I entered the massive, echoing foyer of the venue, several distant relatives spotted me. A few looked visibly relieved that I had shown up to keep the peace. Others looked profoundly uncomfortable, suddenly finding the wallpaper incredibly fascinating. I didn't blame them. Family conflicts make people nervous, especially when they involve large sums of money. I bypassed the ushers entirely and found a seat in the very last row of the ballroom. Not because anyone directed me there, but because from the back of the room you can observe all the exits. It's a habit you never quite lose. The room filled steadily. Soft, elegant string music played through hidden speakers. Guests chatted quietly, the excitement palpable in the air. Every few minutes, someone would glance nervously in my direction, then quickly look away. Exactly 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, my phone vibrated in my inner jacket pocket. It was a text message from Trevor. "Can we talk?" Back hallway, I stared at the screen, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips. I stood up and smoothed my suit jacket. I already knew exactly what this was about. A venue employee, looking stressed and overworked, directed me toward a private, narrow hallway located directly behind the main ballroom, completely out of sight of the arriving guests. Trevor was waiting. Ashley stood tightly by his side, her hands clasped together nervously. The second I saw their expressions, I knew definitively that this wasn't an attempt at a loving reconciliation. This was a high-pressure negotiation, one final, desperate attempt to secure the asset before the legal marriage occurred. Trevor smiled. It was the same polished, utterly fake, predatory smile he had used to deceive everyone for 3 years. "Robert," he said smoothly. I nodded curtly. "Trevor." Ashley crossed her arms, refusing to meet my eyes. Nobody spoke. For several long seconds, the muffled sound of the string quartet drifted through the heavy wooden doors. Finally, Trevor broke the silence. He adjusted his expensive silk tie. "Robert, we just wanted to have one last private conversation before everything officially starts out there." I almost laughed out loud. One last conversation, as if we had been fiercely debating floral arrangements or table decorations, instead of the ownership of my life's savings. Trevor demanded. I signed the deed right then and there. There it was, the ultimate ultimatum. Not an apology for his arrogance, not a shred of understanding for my feelings. The house, always, only. The house. Ashley looked up at me hopefully. She genuinely still expected me to cave under the pressure of the impending ceremony. I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my navy suit jacket. Both Trevor and Ashley immediately straightened up. I could practically see the greedy expectations rising in Trevor's eyes. He thought I was reaching for a pen. Instead of a pen, I pulled out a thick, sealed FedEx envelope. I held it out. "Here," I said quietly. Trevor practically snatched it from my hand. "What's this?" "The deed. Open it," I commanded, my voice flat. Trevor's confident smile faded slightly at my tone. Ashley leaned closer, her brow furrowing in confusion. Trevor quickly tore open the heavy cardboard envelope and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. He began reading the top page. The physical change in his demeanor happened incredibly fast. 1 second, he looked supremely confident, a man who had just successfully executed a corporate takeover. The next second, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Then, the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him deathly pale. And finally, his expression morphed into pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. He flipped frantically through the heavy legal pages. He flipped through them again, his hands shaking, as if different words might magically appear on the thick parchment if he stared hard enough. They didn't. The documents clearly, legally, and permanently outlined the irrevocable charitable housing trust. They showed that, years earlier, the physical property had been completely legally transferred out of my possession. The house was locked down, protected, permanent, untouchable. The property had never been available to inherit. It had never been available to transfer, and it had never been available to use as collateral. Ashley reached out and grabbed several pages from his trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. "Dad, what is this?" I looked directly at her. The truth. For a moment, the hallway was perfectly silent. Then, Trevor completely exploded, not physically, but verbally. And that is the exact moment his entire carefully constructed facade fell apart. "What the hell do you mean, the house isn't yours anymore?" Trevor screamed, his voice echoing violently off the narrow hallway walls. Several nearby venue staff members stopped and stared at us. His voice had become much louder, much more aggressive than he realized. I stayed completely, perfectly calm. The operator in me was fully in control now. "Read the documents. Trevor, it's an irrevocable trust. You've had this plan for years?" Trevor demanded, his face turning red with fury, completely ignoring Ashley standing right beside him. "Yes," I replied calmly. Ashley's face drained of color. She looked at me, completely stunned. You never told me." "No, Ashley, I didn't. Why?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. The answer came easily, straight from my heart. "Because I spent years believing that love should be enough. Because I hoped my daughter cared more about her father than a piece of property. Because I never, ever imagined we would be standing in a hallway on your wedding day, having a hostage negotiation over my home." Trevor looked furious. He didn't look hurt that I had kept a secret. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had just lost a multi-million-dollar gamble. And that was the exact moment Ashley finally, truly noticed what was happening. She looked at Trevor. She saw his raw, visceral reaction. It wasn't about family. It wasn't about broken trust. It wasn't even about my honesty. Trevor's blinding rage was exclusively about losing access to a high-value liquid asset. I watched the horrific realization hit my daughter. It happened slowly, painfully, like a bright light violently turning on in a pitch-black room. Trevor spun toward her, completely losing control. "Why didn't you know about this, Ashley? You swore to me he owned the house free and clear." The accusatory, vicious tone of his voice hung heavy in the air. Trevor kept talking, completely unable to stop himself, too panicked about his collapsing financial schemes to think clearly. "This ruins everything. The margin calls. How the hell are we supposed to leverage a charitable trust?" Months of carefully managed, polite appearances completely disappeared in under 60 seconds. The charming mask slipped, and once the monster underneath was revealed, it could never be hidden again. But I wasn't finished. I reached back into my jacket and pulled out a second, thinner envelope. I handed it directly to Ashley. "What is this?" she whispered, her hands shaking as she took it. "That is Trevor's real portfolio. He's $6 million in debt and planned to let the bank foreclose on your house." Ashley opened the envelope, staring at the damning bank notices and foreclosure warnings. Trevor lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers. "That's a lie. He's a crazy old man." "Page 3, Trevor," I said, my voice lethal. "Federal tax liens. Page 5. Your collapsed offshore accounts. Did you really think you could run a financial con on my family, and I wouldn't run a deep background check on you?" Ashley took a massive step backward, physically distancing herself from the man she had almost married. Tears filled her eyes, but she wasn't crying because of me anymore. She was crying because the man standing in front of her was a total stranger. The silence in the hallway felt enormous. Then, Ashley spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it was incredibly firm. "We're done." Trevor blinked, stunned. "Ashley, baby, wait, we're done, Trevor," she repeated, her voice echoing with newfound strength. She threw the financial dossier hard against his chest. "There is no wedding. Get out." Ashley walked away, her bridesmaids following. Trevor looked at me, pure hatred in his eyes. I just stared back, unblinking. He turned and practically ran out the emergency exit doors. The ceremony never happened. The whispers spread rapidly through the lavish venue. The confused guests slowly began leaving, but I barely heard the commotion. I simply stood there in the quiet hallway, feeling something totally unexpected. It wasn't victory. It wasn't smug satisfaction. It was pure, profound relief. The psychological fight was finally over. The truth was out in the open. For the first few weeks after the wedding spectacularly collapsed, I didn't hear much from Ashley. I didn't push her. Healing from that level of manipulation takes significant time. But a month later, Frank Delaney called me with some surprising intel. The charitable housing trust I had set up partnered with several local organizations. Frank informed me that Ashley had quietly shown up at one of the housing projects for disabled veterans. She hadn't introduced herself as my daughter. She hadn't asked for special treatment. She simply grabbed a paintbrush, worked a grueling 10-hour shift, and went home. Then she came back the following weekend. And the weekend after that. By October, 6 months had passed since the canceled wedding. The Ohio leaves had started changing colors. One Sunday afternoon, while rain tapped softly against the windows, my doorbell rang. I opened the heavy front door, and Ashley stood on the porch. The frantic, stressed energy she had carried for the past 3 years was completely gone. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, holding 2 cups of coffee from my favorite local shop. "Hi, sweetheart," I smiled. "You'd better come in." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had our last terrible fight. She apologized, profoundly and sincerely. She admitted how deeply Trevor's sociopathic financial obsession had poisoned her mind, blinding her to what truly mattered. "I thought losing the wedding was the worst thing that could ever happen to me," she said, tears in her eyes. "But the absolute worst thing was realizing I almost threw away my father." I reached across the table and took her hand. "We both made mistakes, Ashley. After your mom died, I stopped being a father and just focused on solving your problems. I should have taught you how to spot predators, like Trevor." We sat there for a long time, drinking coffee, the rain washing away the past outside. In the end, this catastrophic mess was never really about a house. It was about defining boundaries. It was about maintaining your dignity against manipulation. It was about understanding that loving someone deeply doesn't mean unconditionally surrendering your life to them. I didn't lose my daughter. I simply lost the manipulated version of her that Trevor had created. And frankly, that needed to happen before either of us could truly move forward. If you are ever forced to choose between keeping a toxic peace and keeping your self-respect, never hesitate to choose yourself. Sometimes, the hardest tactical decisions end up being the only ones that save your family.